Welcome back. Maggie and Fred had arrived at her parents' house some time ago, and now had warmed up from being outside in the cool rain and wind. Before too long, they had retired for the night. Maggie soon got over the fact that Sandra was sleeping in her room and in her bed on this night. Sandra, as well as everyone else, were fast asleep, or so she thought. The only sound to be heard was of raindrops pounding on the windows and the wind wailing through the trees. The open flames to that large fireplace in the living room had diminished to smoldering embers. Later that morning, Sandra, who had been sleeping long before Maggie and Fred had arrived, was up and about when she decided to venture into the kitchen and grab some cookies and get some water from the fridge. It would be quite a while before daybreak, and she just couldn't wait for breakfast. Mincy had long ago made her welcome to anything she wanted in the kitchen, so she felt comfortable in getting herself a small bite to eat at such an early hour. When Sandra made the short walk from Maggie's room to the kitchen, passing through the living room, she noticed a man sitting on the couch, also having an early morning snack. That's when Sandra went over to him and said,
"Hello? Well, who are you?"
"I'm Fred. And who are you?"
"I'm Sandra, Minzy and Matthew's guest. Now, let me guess. You're Maggie's husband, aren't you?"
"Yeah, that's right."
"Yeah, Minzy talked about how her daughter would be here this weekend, but she didn't mention anything about her son-in-law. That would be you."
"Well, I can explain why I'm here. I actually had other plans for this weekend, but Mag had some car problems while she was driving here. She called me, so I came to help her out and decided to come along with her to see her parents."
"That's nice. It's so nice when you have other plans, as you put it, but you still take time to see about your wife. Now, I'm sure those plans involve your work. I can tell you're a good husband. You would never run around on your wife, would you?" "Oh, forget that last comment. The question, I mean. Anyway, as for me, well, I'm looking for that special someone."
"Well, let me tell you, you shouldn't have a problem finding that person. I mean, that special someone. You're an attractive woman, you know. And as far as running around, I really don't have time to do that kind of thing."
"But Fred, by the way, I can call you Fred, can't I?"
"Well, that's my name. Sure you can."
"Well, as I was saying, if you did have the time, would you?"
"Well, of course not."
You hesitated, Fred, and forgive my giggle. Oh, there I go again. I'm so crazy. Sorry for getting so personal. Well, anyway, thank you for the compliment you gave me, Fred. I try to keep myself presentable, but like I said, I'm still looking. And as far as you working all the time, as I just said, you were probably working when Maggie called you. And speaking of work, I understand you're an author. What exactly do you write about?
Now, Sandra, who gave you that information? Information about me being a writer, I mean. But don't answer. I guess Missy told you. But anyway, let me answer your question. I write about different things. My first book was about my experience in Hawaii. It was very nice out there, especially the luau. That event was really nice, and I also had a good job. But I was a long way from Meg. Oh, by the way, I didn't tell you, but that's what I call my wife, Meg. But yeah, Meg was all the way back in Detroit. But she wasn't my wife then, when I was in Hawaii. But I'm not going to lie to you. I sure missed her being out there with me, Sandra. We hadn't married yet, And like I said, she was in Detroit while I was in Hawaii. And let me tell you, Sandra, when I was out there, it was such a nice experience. But I'm not going to lie to you, like I said. Although I loved the experience, I really wanted to get back to where Mag was. But she married someone else, Sandra, before I came back. Well, anyway, those are some of the things I write about in my first book, at least at that time, what I wrote about. So let me ask you something, Sandra. You live in Detroit, don't you? And have you ever been to Hawaii?
Well, Fred, you got pretty emotional there talking about your time away from Maggie while in Hawaii. You know, I like men who don't mind sharing their feelings. But anyway, to answer your question, I haven't been to Hawaii, but I sure would like to go someday. I've heard that the scenery there is just gorgeous, especially those palm trees and the luau. That's something I would never forget if I get the opportunity to experience it, from what I've been told. But I may make it out there sometime. I have a sister who lives there.
Oh, so you have a sister out there, huh? But let me ask you another question. How do you know about those palm trees if you've never been out there before? Oh, you don't have to answer that. You probably read about them. But anyway, yeah, the luau is really nice, like I said. I'm sure you'd enjoy it. Fred and Sandra eventually decided that they should end what began as an early morning chat that turned into over an hour of conversation. Sandra returned to her room to spend the rest of the night, the early morning hours, listening to all of the rain and wind going on outside. It was a perfect backdrop for devious thoughts to bombard her mind. Thoughts like how wonderful it would be in Hawaii with Fred. Yes, the wind and the rain continued to provide her with restful sounds of nature, and she thought how fortunate Maggie was to have Fred as her mate. Sandra's thoughts turned to her experience being with Maggie's last husband, John, back in Hawaii. Yes, Sandra wasn't being truthful when she told Fred she had not been to Hawaii. She was there once before. That's how she knew about those palm trees when she was out there and saw Maggie's late husband, John. The thoughts Sandra had were demonic in nature because her mind turned to images of her being romantically involved with Maggie's new husband, Fred. As these devious thoughts continued to flood Sandra's mind, she slowly drifted off to sleep. Everyone woke up the next morning to the raindrops hitting the sides of the house as they had been the night before. Everyone, that is, except for Sandra and Fred. They needed to make up for the sleep they didn't get because of the chat they had during the wee hours of the morning. An hour had passed since Mincy got up to prepare breakfast, and the aroma of the bacon being fried made everyone eager to partake of this and other treats on this morning. The sound of coffee percolating added to the sense of comfort on this cold, snowy morning. Yes, bacon and eggs with turkey sausage and home fries were being prepared. The sound of coffee percolating added to the sense of comfort on this cold, snowy morning. What added to the ambience of breakfast was an old coffee commercial from an era gone by that was playing on a local TV station that Matthew loved. Matthew then commented, "Look at that commercial, you all. They don't make them like that anymore. And do they even have that brand of coffee now?" With Matthew's question, and no one getting to answer him, Mincy and Maggie had just returned from the kitchen. They had completed all the cooking, and now everyone was ready to partake. Yes, everyone, including Sandra and Fred, had by now gotten up and were gathered around the dining room table, carrying on casual conversation. Then Matthew blessed the food. They continued discussion and then began to consume a delicious meal that had been prepared. Shortly after beginning to eat, Missy saw it as an opportunity to introduce Fred to her friend Sandra, not knowing that they had already introduced themselves earlier in the morning. She said, "Fred, I hope you had a good night's sleep, and I know you haven't had an opportunity to meet Sandra, although I've noticed you two carrying on casual talk while we've been here having breakfast." Missy continued to say to him, "But anyway, Fred, Sandra has been so very nice to us, and she's been here a lot lately because Maggie hasn't been here as much, being busy shopping over in Detroit, I suppose. Would you agree with that, Maggie?" "That's right, Mama. I was in Detroit shopping," Maggie responded to Missy's question, trying to conceal her own devious behavior with her co-worker, Freddie. Then Missy continued her discussion with Fred and Sandra. "Well, Fred, I want to formally introduce you to Sandra. Like I said, she's very nice. And Sandra, I'd like to introduce you to Fred, our son-in-law." Both Fred and Sandra greeted each other without giving any indication that they had met each other earlier in the wee hours of the morning. Fred, after nodding his head responding to Missy's introducing him to Sandra, finally gave his response to the comment Missy had made about Sandra moments earlier. He said simply, "Yes, Missy, Sandra seems to be very nice." Then Sandra replied,
"Thank you, Fred."
After a few bites of breakfast food, Matthew decided to get involved in the conversation. He said, "Let me jump in here. It's good to see the both of you. Now, Fred, you haven't been making these trips with Maggie until now. I'm just glad you've come to see us this time, even though it took Maggie being in an accident for you to do it." Then Fred responded, being slightly disappointed with Matthew's comment. "Now, Matt, you're making me feel guilty. And by the way, she wasn't in an accident. She just had a flat tire." "Oh, sorry about that," Matthew responded. Then he continued to say, "But you're still guilty, Fred. You know you should have come up here more often when Maggie comes. But don't get me wrong, Fred. I understand you're a busy man, and I really appreciate you looking after my little girl, especially helping her with that flat tire. Yeah, you're still my buddy. Besides, you're the one who made sure I got to the hospital when I had my accident." Then Fred replied, "Don't bring that up, Matt. I just didn't want you to leave us that day." Then Maggie, being slightly embarrassed by the name Matthew called her in front of everyone, said to her father, "Oh, Daddy, you know I'm not little anymore. But, yeah, I'm so glad Fred was there with you, Daddy, at that time. We were thinking that you had left us." Before Matthew could respond to his daughter's comments, Fred jumped in to reply to his father-in-law's talking about him working a lot. He said, "Yeah, Matt, you mentioned that I'm a busy man, and I've been busy with doing my writing, not to mention my work at MEFCO. But I took the time to come and fix Maggie's car, and here we are." Then Matthew responded, "Well, no hard feelings intended. Just keep on looking after Maggie. You know, Fred, I've called Maggie little girl ever since she was little. And look at her now. My. Just look at her over there, just smiling. But anyway, she's on the road so much coming up here to Flint. Maybe you can come up with her for Missy's birthday next weekend, her birthday party. That is, if you're not busy at work." Then Fred tried to deflect Matthew's last statement in order to avoid making a commitment to coming to Mincy's birthday party the following weekend. Fred knew he was going to discuss plans to be with Courtney at that time. But Maggie changed all that when she called him in the middle of their conversation, when she informed him of her flat tire. And, of course, Fred left Courtney at the coffee shop to drive where Maggie was to give her the help that she needed. So Fred gave only a brief response to Matthew about the possibility of coming with Maggie to help celebrate Mincy's birthday the following weekend. Rather than to focus on what Matthew said, Fred continued to talk to Mincy about what Maggie had been doing. Yeah, Matthew, we'll see about that, about me coming here next weekend. And yeah, Mincy, Mag has been doing a lot of shopping lately, going over to Detroit. At least that's what she told me she was doing when she called me about that flat tire. Then Mincy replied to Fred's comments. Oh, what do you mean, Fred, when you say at least? Don't you believe her? Yeah, of course I do, Mincy. I know Mag would never do anything to hurt me. She's just a nice person, and even a better wife. Why, thank you, honey, was Maggie's simple response. Then Mincy said, Yeah, Fred, lately Maggie's not been here as much on the weekends. Like I said, I guess she's been doing more shopping in Detroit. And I agree with you. Maggie would never do anything to hurt you. Then Sandra got into the conversation.
Well, if I were Maggie, I'd want to be with Fred as much as possible. Yeah, I want to tell all of you, Fred's the kind of man I'm looking for. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not talking about in a literal sense. Well, let me make myself clear. I'm looking for someone like Fred. Someone who don't have time to look at another woman. Fred, you're to be congratulated. Yes, Menzie, Maggie's got herself a good catch. But I'm sure you realize that, Maggie.
I sure do realize that, Sandra. While Maggie had only a brief response to Sandra's comments, Fred seemed somewhat embarrassed by her remarks and didn't respond. Then Matthew bailed both Fred and Maggie out of their dilemma to give a lengthy response to Sandra by asking Fred, So, what's your schedule like the next few weeks, Fred? Busy as usual, Matt, Fred replied. Then he continued, I have a big MEVCO corporate meeting in 2 weeks in Minneapolis.
Hey, I have a sister that lives in Minneapolis.
I thought your sister was in Hawaii, Sandra, Maggie responded.
Well, I have more than one sister, Maggie.
Oh, I see, Maggie replied briefly, not really knowing what to say after that. After a little more discussion, and having completed eating some delicious food, Missy said, Looks like everyone's finished, so I think I'll start the cleanup in the kitchen now.
I'll help you, Menzie.
No, Sandra. Let me do that. You can just go in the living room and relax a little bit, Maggie said. Maggie wanted to help her mother to make up for the many times she had not been at her parents' house lately, claiming to be in Detroit shopping. Meanwhile, Matthew wheeled himself back into their bedroom using the elevator that had been installed in their house. But before he left, he said to Fred, Now, Fred, don't you leave before I come back. But I want you to know I found myself praying for you a lot last night, for you to stay out of trouble. Yeah, I prayed for you just before dinner at about 6 o'clock. I know there's a lot of pressure on you on that job of yours. Then Fred said to his father-in-law, Well, thanks, Matt. I'll just sit in the living room for a while. Yes, Fred had avoided more trouble for himself when Maggie called him about her flat tire in the middle of his conversation with Courtney. It was interesting that Fred received the call at about the same time Matthew mentioned to him that he had prayed the evening before, that he stay out of trouble. Was that a coincidence? It would be an interesting question Fred would ponder for a while. A new concern for Fred would be Maggie's former workmate Sandra. As Fred ventured into the living room, Missy and Maggie were in the kitchen doing cleanup from breakfast, and Fred had returned to his bedroom. So now, Fred and Sandra were alone together, again, as they were in the wee hours of the morning. They continued some of the discussion they had during that time before dawn. Sandra saw this time nice to take a break. At about that time in Fred and Sandra's conversation, Missy and Maggie returned from the kitchen, having finished their cleanup. Matthew would soon join them. By this point, it was noontime, and Sandra said she needed to return home. She began to say her goodbyes to everyone.
Sorry I have to leave you all, but I have things to do at home. It's always nice being with you, Menzie and Matthew, and you too, Maggie. And Fred, it was good meeting you.
Sandra then took off and started on her way back to her apartment in Detroit. Soon after saying his own goodbyes and having helped Maggie during her time of distress, Fred also would be on his way back home to Central Heights, just outside of Chicago. Then Maggie said to her husband, "Thanks, honey, for helping me out there on the road. I know you were probably busy at work when I called you, doing your writing chores or prepping for Mevco." "Yeah, Meg, thanks," Fred said back to her, failing to correct his wife as to what he was really doing when she called, which was having a serious conversation with Courtney at Ed's coffee shop. Maggie added, "Have a safe drive home. I'll return later tonight." With that, Fred bid his farewell to Maggie and her parents and drove off. Maggie remained with Missy and Matthew for the balance of the day before returning home to Central Heights later that night. It would be the end of a troubling weekend for Fred. He would have 2 weeks to prepare for his next trip, which would be his corporate conference in Minneapolis. Return with us next time as Fred travels to his business conference in Minneapolis. And oh, by the way, Sandra will be there too. Well, that's all for today. In closing, I'd like to say, and would like you to remember, whatever you may be going through, whether good or bad, just keep in mind that there's always more good things coming your way. We'll see you the next time.